I'm Suzette Martinez Standring, and welcome to It's All Right with Suzette, a half-hour show about books and the craft of writing. And today, on this wintry December time, we have a wonderful guest, and it will be a pleasure to talk about America's Romance with the English Garden, the title of the book by Thomas J. Mickey, our special guest today. And a word about Thomas. He's a graduate of Harvard University's Landscape Institute, and he is a gardening columnist. His other books include Best Garden Plants for New England, and he's done extensive research and travel into garden-related topics and its history. He's also the Professor Emeritus of Communications at Bridgewater State University, where he's also authored books such as Deconstructing Public Relations and Sociodrama. And I'd like to add that he is an esteemed member of the Toastmasters Club, Quincy Chapter 675, of which we are both members. So I want to welcome you today. And America's Romance with the English Garden. What is the idea behind the book?
Well, the main idea, Suzette, is that the way we garden, we kind of accept that we do things a certain way. For example, we have to have a lawn, and we put the vegetables behind the house, and we have trees in our property that have a height and give us some boundary to the property. All of those elements are really part of the English garden. So the way we garden today is an English garden tradition. And that's the main idea behind the book, that I searched out how we came to have those patterns of gardening. And what I found was that it was really through the marketing of seeds and plants in the 19th century.
Really?
That kind of garden was sold to us. So that's the idea behind the book. The way we garden, we owe to the seed and nursery catalogs of the 19th century.
Oh, that's interesting. Now, when you talk about Americans' romance with the notion of an English garden, you know, I always think of a lot of flowers and all of this kind of stuff, kind of a cottage kind of a setting. What is it about an English garden that's set apart? What are the unique elements of that?
Well, certainly the flowers are important, but in terms of the tradition of how the English garden evolved, there was the first step. This is really an important kind of point of history, that the garden that we have today really dates to the early 1700s in England, when there was this push to have an enormous lawn. And
really?
that was the preeminent symbol of the garden. It was called the modern landscape garden, the new garden. You had to have this enormous lawn. And of course, all formality at that time in garden design was done away with. No formal straight lines, no symmetry. Everything was more pastoral, more picturesque. And the walkways were all curved, and there was often some water, like a lake or something. These were usually very large properties on estates that fostered this new kind of garden design. And it was really also accepted by other kinds of gardens besides these big estate gardens. But that's where it all began. And so this movement to have this sweeping lawn created eventually in the 1800s what we have come to call the romantic English garden, where the lawn is very important, but also by that time a grouping of flowers on the lawn. Mm-hmm. And then behind the house, fruit trees.
Yes.
And trees to line the property. And always a curved pathway to the house, never straight. Those were all kind of elements of that design. And the cottage garden became important because eventually we saw that, by we I mean English garden writers during the late 1700s and into the 1800s, realized that people who live in cottages, workers, as they were called, laborers, also had a particular way of gardening that was really quite beautiful. And that was because the house was very close to the road, and they often had a fence there. They had flowers going from the fence all the way to the wall of the house. That was one of the symbols of the cottage garden.
Nice.
And that became really important eventually. But initially it was this large grassed area which became the English garden. And then eventually the cottage garden became part of it. When the garden of the laborer became important, which really took a long time, at least 150 years, because during that time, the only garden that was talked about was the garden of the wealthy, the garden of the estate owner. Yes. But eventually, because these laborers, of course, in middle class were gardening all along, but their garden wasn't really talked about or written about was only the garden of the estate owner. And by the early 1800s, I would say, the cottage garden became an important expression of the English garden.
Now, you mentioned that the popularity of the concept came about through seed catalogs.
Yes.
And is that how it came to be exported to America?
Yes. Because the English, that's a great question, because the English had this beautiful form of landscape design from the early 1700s, when the colonists came here and started to create gardens. Of course, the early decades were really more for survival.
Yes,
so it was
right.
vegetables and herbs. But people who had a lot of money, for example, there's a wonderful garden in Waltham which illustrates this early garden, and it has this sweeping lawn, the Lyman Estate in Waltham. It's just beautiful. And that was designed in the late 1700s. It was an American version of the English garden. And people in England loved that garden. It was talked about there. But then eventually, by the middle 1800s, middle class people who now were moving outside cities, and they were having their own houses, they wanted to have a lawn just like these estates had. So then we had a movement to a lawn for the middle class. And of course the seed catalogs became really important then, because they illustrated on the catalog cover this kind of lawn that you could now have with the flower beds, and they sold that kind of garden, that English garden, which was really the lawn and the flower bed, which really came down from English.
Well, this might be kind of a quirky question, but in my mind, I didn't realize that the whole lawn concept started in England, you know, because it's something I always associate with suburban America. So, did they have lawnmowers?
No, there were
back
no.
then?
There were during the 1700s. The only way, that's a great question. The only way that they really kept the lawn at the proper height was through size, and this was done with
Wow.
teams of gardeners. Remember that these were on estates, so they had a head gardener and then teams of gardeners who would cut the lawn to the certain length that they wanted. But the lawnmower itself appeared in England about 1830, and then here in America in 1850. And basically the same principle. It was the blades were cutting the grass. It really, the lawnmower has not changed ever since. It's just the energy source has changed in design.
Earlier you mentioned that your book is not so much a how-to of gardening and plants. It's historical.
Right.
It's an historical book. So can you share some more historical insights found
Well,
in your book?
one of the issues was that the garden that appeared in the catalogs
Yes.
was illustrated on the cover and sometimes inside. So the lawn, the curved pathway to the house, and the flower beds. Now that was, of course, basically the English garden design. But all these owners of these seed companies and nurseries were quite educated men. Most of them were men, not all, but most of them were men. And the women also well educated in horticulture. So they knew French garden design, they knew Italian garden design, and of course by the end of the 1800s they knew Asian design. They knew Japanese and Chinese design, which really was becoming important. But the design that appeared in the catalogs over and over again was the English garden. And so you think about that, these catalogs which traveled the country, went from Maine to California. The cover and the illustrations inside were always this basic English garden design, and so that's what people wanted. And so the same garden appeared in Maine that appeared in California.
Oh. Now, what were some of the influential seed companies of the time?
Well, certainly Burpee, W. Atlee Burpee, Robert Bust from Philadelphia, and from Boston, Rawson Seed Company, and also the Joseph Breck Seed Company from Boston, really important. But the seed companies and the nurseries were really, really concentrated on the East Coast for almost the final 50 years of the 1800s. But eventually California and the Midwest created its own seed and nursery business. But Philadelphia, New York, Boston, and of course Rochester, New York really became important because Rochester had a great number of seed companies and nurseries.
Really? Now, are there particular flowers that are more closely associated with an English garden?
Well, that's a great question. The flowers and the plants that we used in the 1800s, and a lot of those we've inherited to this very day, come from English garden catalogs, come from English gardening, because what American seed company owners and nurseries saw in this country was that the English grew that plant it would do well here. So
That's-
we
I
put
was thinking
we put the
that.
plants in our catalogs that did well in England. And
Because
so
we have such a similar climate.
exactly, exactly. But also because people who own these companies looked at the English gardeners as the ones who knew how to garden and they could teach us how to garden. And they were always really deferential to the English garden. The English gardeners have been gardening for centuries. They can teach us how to garden. That appeared over and over again in the catalogs.
You know, we have about 5 minutes before the break, and so what I'd like to ask you are, what are the signature elements of an English garden versus, say, a French garden or an Italian garden?
Well, I mentioned the lawn. The lawn has to be the most important thing.
Okay.
The lawn, and you had to always have the lawn in front of the house. This was very important. Not a vegetable patch in front of the house, which is what's happening today, because now we realize that the lawn is really a great drain on water usage. So in some parts of the country, especially out on the West Coast, there is really a renovation, a whole new idea of creating front garden space, front landscape space. So it's no longer the lawn. And so, for example, in Arizona, there's more use of cactus and more use of stone, which is really not at all English garden design. But that's one of the preeminent sign is the lawn. Then groups of borders of perennials and annuals. Those are also very important. And sometimes they can extend an entire walkway, sometimes be an area in the back or on the side. So borders of perennials and annuals, and then flowering shrubs, groups of flowering shrubs, always in threes. And then fruit trees behind the property, which give often beautiful flowers in the spring. Those are really important. And then trees to line the property. Those are kind of the basic elements of English garden design. The lawn, curved pathway, the fruit trees, the flower beds, and trees to line the property.
And what are some of the differentiating elements of, say, a French or an Italian
Well,
garden?
the Italian
comparison?
garden, that's a wonderful, wonderful style of gardening, is always rock and water, and always levels of gardening, never flat, really, levels, because Italy has such a rocky terrain and such a sloping terrain that was very difficult to have that flat plateau. So it was, and that we learned that the Italian garden design was very important here at the end of the 19th century with somebody like Edith Wharton, who wrote a great book on Italian garden design. So it was the fountains and rock work. Those are really important in Italian garden. And the French garden design has the symmetrical look, which is really traditional in the gardens of Versailles. Straight, so what's on this side is also on this side, symmetry.
Okay, symmetry.
And today people kind of put all of those together.
Yes.
But basically, and of course it's quite possible to do that, so we have a natural kind of design and we have a formal design. Those are the two big different designs.
Well, that's wonderful. Thomas Mickey, author of America's Romance with the English Garden, and we will be back in just a couple of seconds to talk about his process of writing and how he came to create the book. So stay tuned. Hi, and we're back with Thomas J. Mickey, author of America's Romance with the English Garden. And now I'm going to ask you about your process in writing and creating this book on the history of the English garden and how it came to America, which I think is really a fascinating subject. So out of all the elements of gardening history, how did you come to choose this topic?
Well, I teach at Bridgewater public relations writing and marketing. So one day I was sitting in my office and I thought, I would love to know, because I'm a gardener, I would love to know how the garden was marketed to us, how the garden came to be the way it is for us. So I did some research and I realized that the seed and nursery catalogs of the 19th century had lots of illustrations about the garden. So, and then I centered on that focus and I thought, where could I look at catalogs from the 19th century, the business of the seed and nursery companies of the 19th century, the Smithsonian. So I wrote a proposal to the Smithsonian to come down to Washington and to do research for this book, to study the question of how the garden was marketed to Americans in the 19th century. And they invited me down. I made the proposal to the Department of Horticulture at the Smithsonian. They loved it. And for a whole year, I lived in Washington. Actually, I still taught at Bridgewater, but I only taught Monday, Tuesday, and Wednesday, so I could go down Wednesday night. And I spent the whole year, and in the summer, almost all the whole summer, in Washington, looking at seed and nursery catalogs and business records from the seed and nursery industry. So when I got home, then I had all this information, and I thought, now I've got to write the book. So that was the challenge. I was going to put all of this information together. And what was the main idea that I was going to get out of all of this and make kind of the focus of the book? That was the challenge. So the writing really took place then.
I see. Now, I'm curious, you were a year traveling back and forth to the Smithsonian. Did they fund you for that?
Yes, they paid. I had a fellowship.
Oh, that's fantastic.
I had a fellowship too, because they really liked the work. And of course, when the book was done, I went to Washington to the Smithsonian. I gave a talk on the book in a beautiful theater at the Smithsonian. It was beautiful. There was a whole crowd of people. It was really a lot of fun.
Now, your audience, of course, people who are interested in gardening history, obviously, but you know, people who are interested in gardening in general, what do you feel they will come away with by reading your book?
Well, they'll realize that probably that the way that we garden is basically so rooted, that's a great term here, so rooted in marketing. The tools that we use in gardening, the gloves that we use, the container we use, for example, to collect leaves or to transport plants from one spot to another, the knee pads that we use in the garden, all those elements, of course, are important, and I have all of that in my garden. All of that hinges on people who have these items to sell and how they market that to us in magazines, on the internet, in newspapers, on television.
Kind of like how Thanksgiving came about.
Exactly.
The marketing of Thanksgiving turkey and the meal itself.
Exactly.
Very much marketing.
Marketing is a very important way for us to get a sense of how we are supposed to do what we're supposed to do, because marketing creates always to sell something, a beautiful illustration or image of what it should look like. And so marketing, advertising, public relations teaches us not only that something is important, but how it is important to you in your experience right now. And so that's kind of the premise of the book. And so people who are not only interested in gardening and the history of gardening, but also people who want to see how marketing operates in our society would find this book interesting.
Oh, now that's an interesting aspect that I hadn't even considered.
Right.
Because you go into all the background secrets of how the companies came to establish their way of doing it to the American populace.
Right.
Well, that's
so
really
that's
fascinating.
but the fun part of writing the book, when I got home, and I say fun because initially it was a lot of fun because I had so much information, and then I was kind of now funneling all this into a kind of a mainstream so I could find one idea. So the major idea when I was writing the book, the first year, coming back from the Smithsonian, the main idea of the book was the seed company owners and the nursery owners in the 19th century taught us how to garden. That was the main idea, because they not only sold these seeds and plants, but they also sold how to plant them and how to take care of them. They were wonderful writers, beautiful writing, and also very careful instructions on each plant, each kind of seed, and which I found really fascinating. So, but when I wrote that book, that version of the book, and I gave it to several people to read, even when it was at one publisher at that point, they all said to me, "We love this, but it's not quite there yet. We love it because I had so much information." This is one of the hard parts of writing nonfiction, that you have all this information.
Yes.
People don't want information, they want a story. They want a story, they want a narrative.
Right.
So I had to, so then as I was reading it again and again, then I saw a story. The story was that the company owners sold us the English garden.
And you know, that's a great lesson for all aspiring authors about how you can take this mammoth amount of information and distill it down into one clear message.
Exactly.
One clear story.
Exactly.
And how long did it take you to, I mean, you said you were writing. Did you have to do a major editing once you realized that was the story?
Well, I had written, by this time, this was the second year of writing. Then I wrote that version of it probably for 2 more years. So I was into writing the book for 4 years.
I was going to ask you how long it took.
There were several versions of the book till we finally got it really focused on the narrative. And nonfiction, narrative nonfiction is really, really very difficult writing, because you're trying to have the reader be present to whatever that moment was in history. And so you have to create a scene just like you would in fiction.
Right, and that would be creating a sensory experience where you're engaging their sight, hearing, touch, taste, if possible, smells. Smells, big thing in a garden.
For flowers, like for the rose, I was talking, there's a whole chapter about a great rose called Crimson Rambler. Crimson Rambler rose was the most important rose in the mid-1890s into the 20th century. Queen Victoria herself went to see it in a garden. When she went to see it, the sales took off because the Queen had now seen it. And so it appeared in every catalog in this country. And people, great owners of these great companies always said, this is the most important rose, everybody has to have it. So I had to do a whole chapter on just the rose. The rose becomes the story in that chapter.
Wow.
The Crimson Rambler rose. But writing the book was somewhat difficult for me at times, because when you propose the book to a university press, they are very careful, the press itself is very careful about its image in the community, across the country. So they want to have other academics read it to make sure that it's worth printing.
Wow, that's a long process.
That took, sometimes 3 months. So they would send it out to these readers who were always anonymous, and they would come back with comments, and then I would have to address the issues.
Wow.
Then all academic presses do that. They send it out to readers, who then say up or down. And if they say up, sometimes they say with certain provisions.
Wow. So the writing process, from the first gleam in your eye to the actual birth, how long did that take?
4 years.
4 years.
4 years. Because when I came back here after the year at the Smithsonian, I was really tired. It was really a lot of work, and I had so much information. I was happy to be back at my regular job Monday to Friday without having this trip down to Washington. So I wasn't writing really seriously at that time. It was kind of sitting in me. It was kind of, I was just letting it ferment in terms of what I was going to do with all the material. And then after about 6 months, I started to say to myself, I've got to start writing. So then I did, September.
Now, I think one of the challenges for any writer is when you're accumulating information, you end up taking in so much more than you actually use. So before you got to the point of the narrative or the message, the strong message of your book, and you went through all those rewrites, how did you go about deciding what information you brought back, or did you just bring everything back?
Well, there was a lot of information, of course, I did not use in the book.
Yes.
So I had to keep narrowing it down,
But what was your guiding mantra, I mean, for what you were looking for?
Oh, repetition. Repetition. That was a really important concept in revising the book. When I found myself repeating something I had just said 3 pages earlier, for example, one seed company said A, and then I would say another seed company also said A, and then I would say another seed company said A. Well, I said I only need one of those.
I see.
I don't need 3 of them. So then I would edit those other 2 out and keep just one. But I found that only as I was reading it, because the reader doesn't care about the other 2. They only care about the one time, because that was really interesting. But you don't have to give the reader everything you found. You really have to make the story interesting to the reader. So that was the challenge to me, because my style of writing is often I dump everything on the table and I kind of shove it in the lap of the reader. That was a style that I kind of worked with kind of implicitly, and then I realized that's not going to work. You really have to make a story out of it. You have to have a beginning, middle, and end.
How true, how true. Basics for all the writers. You know, in our 5 minutes that we have remaining, you know, for those aspiring writers who would like to write a niche book, or, you know, in your case, it was a history-related gardening book. You know, what are the special challenges that you came across, and, you know, and how did you overcome them?
Well, one of the main issues was that your book has to speak to an audience today. History is wonderful, but it still has to address what people are concerned with today. In the case of my book, one of the things that has happened after the book came out really was, because I talk a great deal about the lawn, and at the end of the book, I raised the question of how long can we continue to have the lawn that we have today, given the environmental issues that we face. So that became a niche to promote the book. People all over the country are really, really interested in creating landscape, and especially a lawn, that's going to be environmentally friendly. So that became a vehicle to promote the book.
And,
so
you cover that in your
and
book.
I cover that in my book. I
Okay.
cover the history of how we came to have the kind of lawn that we have, so that we not be afraid to change course because we adapted one way. There's no reason we couldn't adapt another way. So that's kind of the point that I wind up making in promoting the book often. But that's a challenge for a writer. You have to find in your material something that's going to be of interest to the audience. You of course love it, but there has to be something in it that the audience is going to find helpful.
And relating to a modern audience.
Yes, relating to a modern audience, relating to something that they can tie into. So another issue that I have since come to address often from what I've said in the book is the connection between my book and Downton Abbey. Downton Abbey,
Ooh.
which is a great show, everybody loves it, it has a great audience across the country. Downton Abbey's landscape is really the 1700s landscape of England with the lawn. So that's a major issue in my book. And so sometimes I'm introduced in a radio interview, for example. This is the man who tells us how Downton Abbey really is the kind of lawn we have today.
That's interesting. And you have a chapter on that.
I have a chapter on the lawn.
On the lawn.
In the lawn.
And drawing Downton Abbey references.
Exactly.
Oh,
Well,
that's
I draw reference to Capability Brown, who is the designer of Downton Abbey.
That's fascinating.
So those are all links as you're writing, you always want to find ways that the reader is going to get something out of it.
Yes.
Remember that you're writing it for the reader, even though it's quite satisfying for you to put it on paper and to get it out there.
Now, before we talk about how people can buy your book, can you spend a moment talking about your process? I mean, are you a morning writer, or do you write late at night? What is your whole
I'm a
writing process, biorhythm?
Morning writer, 9 to 12.
Uh-huh.
I can't write real early, but 9 to 12 after breakfast I can write. I'm really disciplined and can write. I read. I always have to read first because I find reading is 90% of writing for me. Getting ideas and kind of germinating what I'm going to be writing today or what I'm going to work with today, that really helps me a great deal. And that's really important. I think
When
for down
reading, you mean other gardening books?
other
or
books
just
related
other
to the
books?
topic that I'm writing.
Got it.
For
Okay.
example, in writing this book, I probably read about 150 books.
Really?
In order to get a sense of the history and the context in which the book takes place, the setting of the book. And I learned a great deal in all of that. So that's really important to me, is always reading. And I have a whole stack of books that have to be read that I kind of niche off as I read one of them. So the reading is important, but I have the morning time as my writing time.
Yeah, that's my time too. I
Okay,
find that I'm
great.
most fresh and most creative.
Good.
And I like to read different kinds of books, even though they're not related to my particular topic, because I'm inspired by other people's style.
Okay,
You know?
that's great.
Now, tell us, how can we buy your book?
Well, the book is available. I just happen to have it here. The book is available on Amazon, but it's also available in Barnes & Nobles and other bookstores in the area, as well as on my blog site, AmericanGardening.net.
AmericanGardening.net is his blog and website. And I also know that you've done a lot of speaking engagements. In fact, Tom Mickey spoke here at the Milton Public Library, and I understand it was very well attended. And do you have anything coming up in January where people can come hear you speak?
I do have some in January, but those are on the North Shore. I don't have any down here.
Are your dates covered on your
They
blog
are
site?
on the blog site. All my speaking dates are covered on the blog site for the next 2 months.
Oh,
So
that's
you
fantastic.
can see it there. But I will be speaking in Wellesley this coming Friday.
What do you find, maybe we could end on, I'm interested in the audience. When you're speaking to them, are the audience members usually surprised at what they come away with? Or, you know, what kind of people usually come to hear you?
Well, there are two kinds of people. Number one, people who are gardeners or interested in gardening. Number two, people who like history. People who like stories from the past that can give us an insight into the present. Those are the two kinds of people that come. But I always talk about how we came to have the kind of garden that we have today and how that has really come down to us as part of the great marketing strategies of the seed and nursery companies.
Fantastic. I want to thank Thomas J. Mickey, author of America's Romance with the English Garden, for being with us here today. And for all of you, don't forget to buy his book on Amazon.com and to contact him through AmericanGardening.net. So thanks very much, and we'll see you again next time. This is Suzette Martinez Standring signing off.